So we're here again to have another conversation we call Attempted Intelligence, where we're trying to model how conversations about quote-unquote intelligence concepts may look like. Now, it doesn't mean that we are intelligent, it doesn't mean that we are correct. It just means that we're at least making the attempt and trying to work through concepts. So the concept that I'd like to bring forth today is the concept of modernism versus postmodernism. So in order to understand one, you kind of have to understand the other, and realistically you can see it in the title. So there's modernism and there's postmodernism, so aka after modernism. Now I've sent you something prior. Do you have something that you can put forth, at least at the moment, as working definitions of either one of those? So if I was to make a suggestion, start with modernism and then go to postmodernism, because it's the thing that contrasts itself to the other.
Well, as always, I find information, I collect my definition and usually clean it up. So
maybe. I don't know if it's going to happen.
I just share that. But modernism, to me, what I found was they believe in one abstract truth.
Okay.
They're looking for one abstract truth. And postmodernism does not necessarily believe in one truth. They don't believe in one universal truth.
Sure.
And I know that we discussed a little earlier about modernism being more of a collective mindset,
sure,
and postmodernism being more of an individual mindset.
Okay, and we'll maybe touch on those. So sometimes we do have conversations prior to getting in front of the camera, and when we have those, if we mention them in a certain way without the context in which they happened or without the rest of the information, it's not necessarily good explicit communication. So it's like an inside joke. And inside jokes are usually horrible, aside from between the people that are on the inside. So the thing that I'd like to ask about, so you essentially say, or you've put forth that modernism would be one abstract truth. Why the term abstract? Do you have a reason for that, or is that what you read?
It's what I read. So I don't have a direct understanding of why it would be abstract.
Okay. Now the reason I question that is because it's a term that would require definition contextually. So the idea of abstract maybe being non-tangible.
Okay.
Right. So what a truth that isn't tangible could be said to be abstract. So you can't touch it, I can't touch it, but it's there, whether we can touch it or not. Okay. Right. So then postmodernism essentially saying that there isn't one abstract truth, there are many truths. Right. So if we compare those definitions, right? So maybe to clean it up, what I would say is, or what I would add, is to say that modernism modernism and postmodernism are not terms that are clean in any way. They are where they are identifiable as specific things.
I definitely found that as I was looking up. They're not clean.
No, where they refer to very, very specific things is usually in art, architecture, literature,
culture,
right? Things of that nature. Whereas scientifically, they don't tend to apply as cleanly. But in a very, very broad sense, modernism or modernity would be the scientific enlightenment. Okay. Right. So believing in the scientific method, especially early on as it presented itself. And then postmodernism is essentially a response to that, and it tends to be a critical tradition, a tradition that criticizes more than anything else. It says, well, you created that, so whatever, I can create something too. So to maybe again make that cleaner, is postmodernism is very, very broadly is critical of things from modernity or from modernism, aka scientific enlightenment, the scientific method, especially the early scientific method. Now, that would set up something that is a bit of a dichotomy, and in terms that you and I have used before and examined before, as far as epistemologies or theories of knowledge or theories of truth, which one of them that we've talked about would map well to modernism, and which one would map well to postmodernism?
Well, looking at things that we've talked about before, modernism would more broadly line up with positivism.
And now, do you have a definition for positivism, just to refresh?
I believe, and again, I feel they're very close in the sense that they're believing in one truth.
So regardless of observer, there is one truth.
Correct.
Regardless of observer. And then postmodernism
would align more with constructivism.
Constructivism. Now, do you have a working definition for that?
This is the I'm trying to remember
How I've said it in the past?
No, just
okay.
Because I was looking it up and trying to understand that, but it's more so that they use their experiences,
Sure.
and they draw from their experiences new knowledge and
Okay.
construct their own.
So the way that I would say it is that positivism, there is a single truth,
Right.
regardless of observer.
Right.
Constructivism, the truth is entirely dependent on the observer,
Right.
on the individual, right? So now these are not perfect mappings; these are rough, right? But the underlying assumptions of modernity would be positivist. There is something that is true regardless of who's observing. Therefore, we can approach agreement.
Right.
Right. We may not get agreement, but we can approach it. Whereas constructivism, or really, in this case, postmodernism, essentially says that the truth is entirely constructed by the individual. It doesn't say that it's out of touch with others.
Right.
It says that it's constructed by the individual, such that you've had experiences in specific locations where maybe I've been in the exact same locations and my experience has been somewhat different and colored or informed by my previous experiences. So we were there, we can agree on the central thing that happened, but the truth lies or is more informed by my experiences for me and your experiences for you. So postmodernism would essentially say that the truth is constructed by the individual. Now, again, it doesn't mean that it's out of touch with others. It means that when in touch with others, I construct my own reality. And that's fine.
Yeah.
Right? When presented that way, it seems somewhat benign. Right? But if you plot something out, right, in either direction, so positivism, there's one truth, you take that too far, and that can very easily be some form of totalitarianism. There's only one truth, I'm not listening to you.
Right.
We've proven it. It's like, yeah, but your proof is weak, right? No, one truth.
One truth.
Right? Now, you go the other way with postmodernism, which tends to be more individualistic, and the underlying epistemology tends to be constructivism. It doesn't mean that it always is, but it means that there are multiple realities as constructed by the individual. That you take that and it essentially becomes, you can't tell me anything because I create my own world, right? So in either direction, there becomes a problem.
Right.
So, well, what do you do to try to bring those together? Post-positivism, right? So both exist on some level, both have their strengths and weaknesses, we use them where most appropriate. But the idea of the post-positivist is that there is still the central belief that there is a common reality, or that there is a singular reality that we can at least approach, right? So if we talk about postmodernism as a critical tradition, right, with what you found about postmodernism, what did it essentially attempt to do?
From what I was looking at, it really did, well, you keep using the word critical, and a lot of the words that I saw were just questioning.
Okay.
Always looking at it and questioning, not necessarily anything in particular, but just questioning the ideology or the idea itself in its search for truth.
Sure. So the essential contention of postmodernism would be that science and the scientific method are created by people.
Yes.
Right. So it's not even a real thing. It was created by people. So like, how is it an objective thing? We created it. How are governments real things? How is one thing the same in place A versus place B when they don't have a lot of shared traditions? Right. The idea being that we created it, or humans created it, therefore it's biased inherently and it's all problematic. And that's not an unfair statement, right? Because there was a time frame in which the scientific method as put forth was developed by individuals through a time frame, and as it's continued to be used by varying individuals over time, it's been refined more and more and
developing,
more.
right?
Because there have been varying people taking their reality and kind of pouring it in. So there is merit to postmodernism, to the idea that things were created by people, therefore there are flaws in them. Right? That's not an unfair thing.
Right.
The challenge being that if you stay there, if everything is about the individual, or the truth is created by the individual, how do you ever have agreement?
Because it's about the individual, so you would only have...
Well, and it doesn't mean you would only have that. It's just much harder.
Right.
When the individual is the center of truth, then you're going to have a hard time coming to large-scale agreements. So depending on what you're looking at, if you're looking at personal experience, postmodernism's fine, right? But if you're looking at societal level problems,
Okay.
postmodernism tends to rely on the individual, therefore it's going to have a harder time identifying similarity.
Because it's going to be based on the individual.
Yeah, so it's going to highlight the individual as opposed to the individual as different, as opposed to the individual as similar, right? Positivism tends to attempt to find similar, right, to pull it out.
Right.
Now, when we talk about constructivism and positivism, the methods of constructivism as an epistemology or as a theory of knowledge are interesting because they are relying on the individual to provide information, provide data points. Right? So various constructivist methods or qualitative methods are relying on the individual to provide information. And then what you're trying to do is, between individuals, you're trying to find out the pattern. Right? So constructivism doesn't necessarily mean postmodernism, but constructivism underpins postmodernism. Right? Because constructivism, when done well, or constructivist methods or qualitative methods, will take a population of individuals and begin to query them. And then what you're going to get is you're going to ask, usually what you see is sample sizes of between 10 and 40 people-ish, because what you're looking for in constructivist methods or qualitative methods is a term called sufficiency, where we've interviewed multiple people until no new themes emerge. So we interview 30 people and we have 40 themes, then we interview 31 people and we have 40 themes. We interview 32 people, we have 40 themes. We don't need to talk to anybody else. We've got the themes, we've got the similar things now we can analyze. Right, so constructivism as a methodology and qualitative methodologies essentially create emergent things that we can find when we query different individuals in the way that they create knowledge and the way that they create truth. Versus positivism tends to do it based on a quantity, more often than not, a measurable thing, right, that people can agree upon. There's a standard, and you continue to do that. And then it creates much larger data sets. So a quantitative methodology or a positivist methodology is going to require larger numbers.
Like, are we talking hundreds, thousands?
It depends on what you're looking at.
Right.
Completely depends on what you're looking at. But then what you're going to do is you're going to say, okay, we examined a bunch of people, we found some similarities, we have our data plots, there's all these different points, right? There's an outlier over here, an outlier over here, they exist, they're real, but more or less we're going to see this phenomena 75% of the time.
So it's more of a prediction, like you're looking at those patterns and...
If they continue to repeat in multiple situations, they're predictive.
Right.
If they do not continue to repeat, they're not predictive and we need to adjust.
Okay.
Right. So we're having a somewhat vague discussion of those things, but essentially what it comes down to is when you look at positivist research, usually numbers are larger. Constructivist research, generally numbers are smaller within a given investigation.
Right.
And it doesn't necessarily mean one is better than the other. It means they're looking at different things and they're applying rigor appropriately. Where both of those, where we're attempting to apply rigor, a postmodernist would essentially say, well, that's a man-made method, so why am I listening to you? Right? So there's just the opportunity to continue to undercut.
Right.
At no point will postmodernism allow you to come to an agreed upon position. Now, the reason that I wanted to bring all this up and maybe dance around it and have certain discussions is that postmodernism is a thing that has essentially, as a tradition, as a philosophical tradition, birthed other things that have shown up in varying academic institutions. Not necessarily in all academic departments, but in varying academic institutions. And in attempting to pull it back to the level of analysis back to the individual and say it's your feelings and your experience and all of those things that create truth, and make that the dominant paradigm, then what, especially in relation to postmodernism as the initial starting point of that,
Right.
is to say that it's almost fatalistic. There's nothing you can do about it. We can't agree on anything. We never will, because we create our own truths, and if we agree, it's kind of accidental and whatever, right? So it's this thing that kind of undercuts and won't on its underlying assumptions allow for agreement, right? So you start to see this, and you start to see people in varying academic traditions training people underneath them, and then that spreads in general society, and then you have the opportunity to have a larger population of people who have credentials who say don't trust science, and they're in institutions whose basic underlying assumptions is that science matters and it can elucidate truths.
Right.
The scientific method can elucidate truths. The scientific method isn't necessarily one thing.
Right.
It's a singular concept that has a lot of things that have sprouted from it. Right? So we've talked about positivism, constructivism, post-positivism. Depending on what you're investigating, there are ways to do it that are effective, that create fairly stable truths. So if you look at modernism as a philosophy, as a general underlying assumption, produced things like industrial revolutions, varying technologies such as cell phones, YouTube, Google, right? All of these things require agreement. They require some central agreement. Is the data that technology runs on perfect? No, not at all. But it is, for the most part, good enough to create technology and move forward. So the post-positivist position being that humans are flawed and they're going to have a hard time getting to the absolute truth, but we can do a really good job getting close,
Right.
allows us to have these things that we can agree upon and work forward with. And when it doesn't work, it's really obvious. Because something went boo. Right? It didn't do what you said it would do. It's really obvious.
So do those work in conjunction? I mean, looking at technology and modernism and postmodernism, and looking at how technology works and then questioning it and going, this could be better, or we made this, it's most likely flawed, can we make it better because it's most likely flawed because we made it? Is that part of the innovation? Is that part of the development?
Maybe not as such, because science is a self-correcting mechanism, because essentially you have a hypothesis, you test it, and it either worked or it didn't. And when it didn't, you need to adjust. So science already has criticism built into it, which is why the methodologies and the discipline that falls under the broad umbrella of the scientific method is fairly wide and has varying specialties, but it all falls under that umbrella conceptually. Whereas postmodernism is essentially, as it emerged, was just criticizing. So it's almost like an outsized critical mechanism.
Okay.
Right? It's fine to have criticism. Science requires rigor. Science requires criticism. The scientist is flawed. The criticizer is flawed. But over time, given enough time, given the opportunity to refine, you will start to identify those, right? Through the scientific methodology. So postmodernism, as far as I'm aware, hasn't created anything that broadly alters much as far as day-to-day life is concerned, aside maybe from thought patterns, right? And there's nothing wrong with the critical thought pattern. The critical thought pattern can identify flaws. It can help you, when you've identified them, maybe think differently. Think differently than people have previously thought. Great idea, right? But it doesn't always work in a way that moves things forward. So this brings me back to the concept that depending on what you're investigating, positive position is better versus a constructivist position for other things, and then a post-positive position depending, again, on what you're doing. So the governments should be positivists, right? More or less. Right? Or maybe broad municipal services should be positivist. Like, we want to make sure that we're not spreading germs the way we pick up garbage. The way we ask you to collect garbage, the way we collect garbage, the way we put garbage into a central location, make sure it doesn't leach into groundwater. That should be positivist. There's an agreed upon position that helps keep yucky stuff out of the water. Right? Human experience is constructivist. I can't get around the fact that your experiences and my experiences are different. I can't get around that. I don't think you can get around it,
Right.
but we can, emerging from that, we can find similarities in places that we agree, and we can find places that we disagree. That's okay, right? But constructivism will allow us to do that.
Right.
The post-positivists would say, okay, the government official, I'd rather my government official be a post-positivist, so they can include the human experience, and then they can also say, yeah, no, I want to keep the yucky stuff out of the water,
Yeah.
right? And there's a way to do that. So overall, what I would say is that discussing postmodernism and relating it to constructivism and discussing modernism and relating it to positivism just shows that everything has its place, and none of them do well when they attempt to dominate the other.
So just solely by themselves, they're not gonna. It's
No, because if it was all about my individual experience, would you have a cell phone?
no.
Unless I was absolutely inspired and was able to create all kinds of manufacturing processes, machines, completely on my own, in my own lifespan. I had all this I don't know how it would happen.
Right.
It's not that it's impossible.
Yeah.
It's not that it's impossible.
No, I'm saying there's a possibility.
It's very difficult. Whereas humans, funny enough, seem to work best in a collective sense, right? We need some form of agreement to get along. If we don't have agreement, we don't get along, and all we do is fight. And then I'll break your garbage truck, and you'll break my garbage truck.
So we should all agree that a broader form of communication is required. Hey, we should.
There are some things that we should agree on,
Yeah.
so that they work.
Right.
But it may not
for
be
that,
perfect. It may not be all the way correct, but it works well enough for now. And we should reserve the right to change over time.
Right.
So critical thinking, right? The critical mechanism in the scientific method, or if you like postmodernism critiques, that's okay.
Right.
But just recognize the strengths and the weaknesses of these things. Recognize their underlying assumptions. So the postmodernist probably does a better job of getting you in the fields, right? Understanding emotions of the individual, which relates well to constructivism, but they're not necessarily one and the same, right? Constructivism, I would say, as an epistemology, has good rigor related to it, where postmodernism it's basically like a bunch of jerks in the peanut gallery making fun of stuff, right? And then you ask them, well, how would you fix it? I don't know.
Yeah.
It's like, you're really good at critiquing things, but I don't know if you're good at building anything. Right? And it's good to have a skill. So you can be a really good criticizer, right? But that doesn't mean that the criticizer is good at building things. So there's a place for criticism, there's a place for blind optimism, right? But when blind optimism is going to hurt a bunch of people, maybe we should do something about it.
Right.
So each thing has its place, it's just these things shouldn't necessarily dominate. They all have effective spheres of influence. And within those spheres of influence, they should be used appropriately, but when it begins to cross over into another, we should recognize that. So the hope is that you and I discuss these things so that you and I understand them, but then also these discussions help to maybe in some way encode the information about basic philosophy of science concepts that is able to be wielded by other people, right? Because if you're confused, one of the things that seems to be happening in popular culture is there's a lot more criticism, there's a lot more postmodernism, essentially.
Right.
And there are people who would say that they're criticizers or they're this or that, but they're not postmoderns, and that's okay. They can define themselves however they want. That doesn't matter. But the idea is that what you're seeing is nobody trusts anybody else. Right? There may be financial incentive to say, I don't trust what this news organization said, you should trust me, right? So if I convince you to trust me, I can take your attention away from them, get your attention towards me, and I can make more money off you. Right? So there may be incentive packages there, but what you're seeing is really good criticism and no solutions. All right? So if you're engaging in some form of media outlet and you're having a hard time figuring out why they say different things or why this media outlet says something that just doesn't match with your own lived experience, well, it's, everybody's creating their own truth, right?
Right.
There's a claim that we may be in the post-truth era, and postmodernism can be equated to post-truth, right? There is no truth, just mine, and that can be dangerous, right? So the whole point in bringing it up is to have the conversation that postmodernism is good at criticism, but maybe not necessarily good at creating anything beyond criticism.
Right.
Right. So, do you have any thoughts that you'd like to wrap this up with?
Just what you were talking about before, and understanding that they all have their own spheres, and I really like how you kind of summed that up, and just reiterating the fact that they all have their strengths, and we have to accept that.
We don't have to.
Well, sorry.
It would be in our best interest.
It would be in our best interest to accept that having more than one tool to use and understand what's happening to us and the world around us, and using those tools appropriately at the right time.
Yeah, so very, very simply, what I would continue to say is that positivism, one truth regardless of observer, is good for things where we require agreement and things that are beneficial to large groups of something, right? I don't necessarily want to qualify that, whereas constructivism is more considerate and more appropriate for analyzing human experience, day to day, moment to moment, and post-positivism does a good job of at least attempting to balance the realities of both of those. So as epistemologies, as theories of knowledge and theories of truth, those are very good things to wield because they help you understand the underlying assumptions of a lot of other things. Postmodernism most closely resembles constructivism, where modernism most closely resembles positivism. Hopefully I said that right, because I feel like I said something wrong there. Modernism, positivism. And there are problems with all of these things. We should accept that there are problems. We should accept that over time we'll refine our ability to use all of these. And it's okay that they all exist. They don't have to fight, right? They're the people who like to be in one of those three places, one of those four places, who like to be in one place are more likely to double down and fight. But it is unwise, and for people who actually understand fighting and violence, they will recognize that it's important to understand the strengths and weaknesses of your opponent, and you cannot deny their strengths. If you deny their strengths, you are oblivious to what is about to knock you out, right, and to harm you. So recognize that all of these things have strengths, and they should be used for their strengths, or they should be interfaced with for their strengths. If you deny them and you say that your strengths are better than their strengths, then you're in a fight that you can't win, right? Because if you go into their sphere of influence, they win, right? So just to understand that. So for myself, understanding the underlying assumptions of something, of a concept, of a method, are very important, and understanding the strengths and weaknesses so that I can better evaluate what comes out of them. So hopefully that makes sense, right? Who knows?
It's attempted intelligence.
Attempted intelligence. Me and you will continue to talk, and we will continue to share.